Okay, so hello again to those of you who just joined, and thank you so much for joining us today for our fall evidence-based practices, submissions, process, and overview. We're really excited that so many of you were able to join us today, and I know that some of you will be sharing this with your colleagues, and there might be some who might be listening to this recording later on. So just to introduce myself, my name is Linda Krisawati, and I am our Senior Program Manager at AMCHIP. For evidence-based practice, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Laura, to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Linda. My name is Laura Powis, and I am the Program Manager for Evidence-Based Policy and Practice on the team with Linda, and really excited to be here today and tell you more about Innovation Station.
Thanks, Laura. So just to give you a kind of snapshot of where we're headed for the next 50-55 minutes or so, we'll give you a brief introduction to Innovation Station and touch kind of a little bit high level the different components. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time today actually going into the submissions process. Some of you might be joining us and have previously submitted a practice to Innovation Station, but there are a lot of really exciting changes that we've actually been working on over the summer that Laura will tell you a little bit more about. So even those of you who have participated before on these calls, we have a few new things that you'll learn as well. So we'll do that, like I said, for the bulk of the conversation today. And then we'll have time at the end, approximately 15 minutes or so, for you to ask any questions, which you can do through the chat box. We also, because this is set up as a webinar, we also have the Q&A function where you can type in your questions directly. So again, we're really excited to have you and be able to kind of tell you about Innovation Station a little bit more, and then some of the changes that we have for our fall review. So first and foremost, you may have signed up for this webinar not knowing what Innovation Station is, and that's perfectly fine. Just to kind of make sure we all have a firm understanding of what Innovation Station is. It essentially started out, over 10 years ago as a database or repository of effective MCH practices. But over time, Innovation Station has actually grown to be more of a comprehensive online platform and resource. So it's not just the database, but it also includes other tools and resources that help you search for, implement, and submit those effective or successful practices and strategies that you might be working on, in your states and in your communities. So these are our main Innovation Station resources, and you'll see that we've matched them with the kind of appropriate function that they have related to that last slide that I showed you. So that search function, that really is the Innovation Station database, which we kind of consider the heart of Innovation Station overall. Next, we have our implement resources. So these are things like our replication projects and our implementation toolkits. And then the submit function, that's related to our best practice referral and submissions process. And so we're really going to be spending most of the time today talking about the search and submit functions. So our database, this is probably the resource you might be most familiar with. And like I mentioned before, this is really how Innovation Station got its start. And it's certainly grown over time, but essentially it's an online database or repository, of what's working, across the US, as it relates to MCH populations. And so really it's an opportunity for you to see what's out there, to connect with colleagues, to connect with potential partners or stakeholders, but to really just get a feel for, what are others doing? How are others addressing some of the same MCH challenges or issues that we're working on? And to kind of learn from what others have shared, and then to be able to kind of adapt or implement that yourself. So this is our practice continuum, and some of you may be familiar, a little bit more familiar with our submissions process rather, and know that we have different categories for kind of classifying the practices that get into our Innovation Station database. And so you'll see that we think about practices as being on a continuum, kind of demonstrating differences in levels of effectiveness. And so by having a continuum, it actually allows us to think more expansively, more broadly about what an evidence-based practice is. And it allows us to capture a lot of really good ideas that might be very early in their implementation, but they seem like they're working. So our continuum really does allow for a lot of flexibility, and it's a lot more inclusive in thinking about what actually constitutes an evidence-based practice. So we kind of start on the left the left end here and thinking about our cutting edge practices. So this is actually our newest category. It's about 3 or 4 years old now at this point. And so this is a way for us to capture those early practices that maybe don't have any evaluation data to really support them, in their effectiveness or to demonstrate that they're effective. But you've seen, some other sorts of, kind of anecdotal or have anecdotal evidence to demonstrate that it seems to be working. So again, these are good ideas. They could also be practices that are long established, but might not have any evaluation data yet. So this is a really good place for us to capture those ideas. Moving up our continuum, we then have emerging practices. And so practices that fall into this category, these are ones that are, you can see how they're kind of scaled up in rigor and what we expect. So we're expecting that you have an actual foundation to your practice, and that you can explain how you've used different guidelines or standards or focus groups to create this particular practice, and can explain why the practice works the way that it does. You have a plan for evaluating your practice, even if it's not in place, you're not collecting any data yet. As long as you have that evaluation plan, you've kind of thought about what you would measure or assess. And then you've also started to think about continuous quality improvement. So here at the emerging level, we phrase it as identifying lessons learned, but starting to think about some of those things that you could then build off of in order to become a promising or best practice. So then moving up our continuum to the promising category, again, you'll kind of see how this is even more rigorous, or we expect a lot more than what we expect in emerging and cutting edge. When we get to this category, we're looking for an actual continuous quality improvement process that you have in place, that you're actively using that to identify what's working, what's not working. You've identified any potential biases in your evaluation, that might impact how you're analyzing the data, and how you're, kind of discussing or thinking about the results that you're seeing. You're actually able to show through your data that your practice is working. And then you're also thinking about ways to identify any unexpected kind of results or outcomes from your practice as well. And then when we move up to our last category, this is a best practice. And I think when a lot of you think about best practices, you're probably thinking about this category, right? In this category, you can see where what we're expecting is fairly well aligned with how a lot of others in public health think about a best practice. So at this level, we're looking for you to be able to identify through your evaluation that the results that you're seeing are because of your practice, and not because of other programs or activities that are impacting that population that your practice is serving. There's some element of being peer reviewed, and you'll see in our submissions form, we've actually broadened this and are thinking about it more as like external validation. So thinking about ways that others outside of your organization have also determined that your practice is effective. And then we're also looking for that element of generalizability or replication, so that you've replicated your practice in another setting or with a different population, and you've seen similar results. So again, just really wanting to emphasize that a lot of people might not decide to submit, or are hesitant when they don't really know what Innovation Station is, because they think of best practice and they immediately go to that fourth category. But I think kind of in laying out the continuum in this way, hopefully a lot of you on the call are thinking, oh, I could do that. We might fit in cutting edge, or we might fit in emerging, and that's great. And I think also to share that, with Innovation Station, Laura and I are really working hard to provide a lot more technical assistance and support to help you move up that continuum as well. So all around, it's a learning opportunity, it's a TA opportunity, and we're really excited to be able to share this with you and some of those exciting developments that we're working on. So on this slide here, this is a breakdown of our practice continuum, so you can get a feel for how many practices we have overall in the database, and then also thinking about how many practices we end up with in each of these categories. So immediately, just like when I look at this, my eyes automatically go to the middle, because that's where the bulk of our practices are in Innovation Station. Most of them you'll see are between emerging and promising. So this is for a few different reasons. So when I showed you the last slide with the continuum and the criteria, when you were looking at the best practices category, the fact that a best practice has to satisfy all of the criteria for all of those other categories, you can see where there are a lot of things that you might have to check off or have in place. So best practices, it is possible to be a best practice, and we certainly do have a number in Innovation Station, but there are a lot more things that we're looking for. And so that's one of the reasons why we have fewer practices that meet that designation. On the other end, we have cutting edge. So cutting edge is smaller than the other categories for a few different reasons. Like I mentioned on the last slide, cutting edge is one of the newer categories, or the newest category. So, it hasn't been around as long. But the other thing that's really interesting about cutting edge that we wanted to share is that this is actually a time-bound category. So with cutting edge, ideally practices within the 2 years that they're designated as a cutting edge practice, the idea is that they would focus on improving their practice based on feedback that we provide during the review process, and they would improve their practice and then resubmit to ideally have moved up the continuum. So you will notice if you go in Innovation Station that we haven't actually implemented a strict policy around this yet. So you will see some older cutting edge practices that are probably about 3 years old at this point, but we are in the process of archiving them. So if you do end up a cutting edge practice and you don't choose to resubmit, or you don't move up the continuum, we do archive those practices after 2 years. To support practices to move up the continuum, Laura is actually working on one of those exciting opportunities that I mentioned. So we are working to provide kind of a technical assistance cohort to support practices that do get accepted into the database as cutting edge, to provide them technical assistance and tools and resources in a cohort structure or setting to help them move their practice up the continuum to ideally emerging or above. So stay tuned for more information about that. Laura is actually working on kind of getting a pilot for that up and started for some of the cutting edge practices from our spring review back in June. So like I said, really exciting opportunity, and we're really trying to provide more resources and tools to help you move your practice up the continuum, so you don't necessarily have to figure that all out on your own. We can help you with that. So this slide is showing a breakdown of where practices come from. So you'll see, according to our map, that we certainly have some states who have quite a few practices in Innovation Station, but you'll also notice that there are a few states and territories where we don't necessarily have any practices from. And really, the beauty of Innovation Station is that anyone can submit, and we would love to have practices that really represent the breadth and diversity of what everyone is doing to address MCH, challenges or issues. So if you're from one of the states or territories that is here and doesn't necessarily have anything listed, or even if you're from a state or territory that has a practice in Innovation Station, if you know of colleagues from some of these places that don't have practices, we'd highly encourage you to reach out and to consider submitting, because we would really love for Innovation Station to reflect all of the wonderful, innovative, effective ideas that are out there. Just to flag 2 exciting upcoming opportunities that we have, or changes that we're making to the Innovation Station database. So one of these, Laura is heading up with our AMCHIP policy team. So this is based on a request that we've had from quite a few states and colleagues at this point. Is they love that Innovation Station has different tools and programs that they can adapt or replicate to their settings, but what about policies? What about evidence-based policies? So we're thinking about this as both kind of big P policies, but also little p policies like procedures or protocols that you might have, within health centers or within your organizations or within clinics. So this is something, like I said, that Laura is working on, and we're actually in the process of standing up the pilot right now. So kind of testing the criteria and the submissions form with a few sample policies. But this is something that ideally folks would be able to submit to starting in next year. So we're really close to getting this launched, but pretty soon you'll be able to also submit these evidence-based policies. Or if you don't necessarily think you have anything to submit, it will be something that you can search Innovation Station for and you can learn from on your own. The other kind of new development that we have for Innovation Station that is still in the works, this is our data best practices track. So I think in understanding that, data methodologies are a little bit different than practices, they're a little bit different than policies. So the idea here is that we would be collecting different methodologies related to, data acquisition, data analysis, data communication, or visualization, and that we'd be sharing those as well. So this track is still kind of in its very early stages at this point, but it is something that we are working on, and hopefully this is something that you can submit to, in the next year or so, or something that you can, access in our database and learn from. So at this point, the next kind of aspect of Innovation Station that I wanted to focus on, and this is really what we're going to spend most of our conversation on today, is the submit feature. And so this is really all about why most of you are probably on our call today, and that's to learn more about the submissions process. So to access the submissions materials at this point, after the webinar is done, Laura and I will make sure to send you the Word doc or the PDFs, and the links as well. But if you do want to access this through our website, you can go to Innovation Station, like through our Innovation Station site, and you'll see here that there is a button on the website that says Submit a Best Practice to Innovation Station. And so when you click on that, it'll actually bring you to this next page. This is an old screenshot. We actually just uploaded all of the materials right before this orientation, but if you scroll to the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to access the links to the Word docs and the PDF versions of the submissions form. We also have another tool we'll share with you in a minute called the minimum criteria checklist, which you also will be able to access there as well. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, this sounds great, but what I want to submit to Innovation Station, I'm not really sure if it would fit. Does it make sense to go in the database? And so this is usually where we used to have a slide that was like, what are we looking for? And then we say, we're looking for whatever you have. And it really is that simple. It's if you have something that you're doing that's working, whether you have evaluation data for it or not, if you're working on it or your colleagues are, or you know of something and it's related to an MCH population or issue, then we definitely would love for you to submit it to Innovation Station. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a program. Well, we certainly have a lot of things that we would classify as like programs. We also have things that are collaboratives, or there's some sort of structures that different organizations have set up, and that is the practice. That's what they're sharing, is how they created this coordinated structure, and that's how they get their work done, and it's kind of enhanced their work or made it more effective. We have some that are focused on workforce development, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be an MCH topic. Workforce is also a part of that. So we certainly have some, practices that are focused on kind of enhancing or supporting the MCH workforce. Anything that's related to, working with communities or working with families. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be like an MCH, focused topic, that you're sharing with us. Like, these are the sort of things that all lead to improved MCH outcomes. So even if it's focused on workforce or it's focused on partnerships or the way that you do your work, those are all things that are incredibly valuable that others could learn from and could potentially, replicate or adapt to their own setting. And then we also have, different toolkits and curricula as well. So we certainly have, especially with the curricula, we have, ones for different settings or contexts that organizations have put together. And that's something, that someone can go into the database and they can pick that up and they can, kind of plug that into their organization's work and they can replicate that. So I guess essentially the two criteria for you to consider, submitting is it something that's working? Or three, I guess. So is it working? Is it something that, is touching on MCH in some way? And is it something that we think others should know about or should be able to replicate? And so if you've got all three of those, then we highly recommend that you consider submitting, and chances are you're probably going to at least fall in that cutting edge category. So, this is all well and good, and you're probably, that sounds nice, but like, what's in it for me, right? It probably sounds like we benefit, because we're able to push this out and others can access it, but we wanted to share just a few of the benefits for those of you who would think about submitting. So as far as the submissions, the benefits to doing this, it really is an opportunity for you to share what's working with your peers, right? So that others can learn from this. We also have opportunities for you to receive recognition at a national level, which is really exciting. So here you'll see these are some of our award winners from our AMCHIP 2020 conference, which just happened last month. I can't believe it was already a month ago, but just the beginning of August. So they received awards. They were, we're able to provide for our award winners. They're able to receive registration for the conference. We're able to travel them to the conference. So a really nice opportunity to be featured and recognized for your work. Something that we're also, have been working on as well is to provide other opportunities to support you to share your work at other conferences. So Laura and I are actually supporting 2 practices right now to develop an abstract to share their work at an upcoming national conference. So we do try to help you get some national exposure and recognition for your programs and practices. One of the other things that's really great about Innovation Station is that everyone gets feedback. So whether or not you get accepted to the database, you can still get feedback on your practice. The other thing I would share too is you can also get feedback on your practice whether you even decide to submit in the first place. So, Laura and I are always happy to take a look at what you're working on and, kind of give some suggestions and feedback from our perspectives as well. The next bullet, or I guess the next benefit, this one is, fairly altruistic, but you really are helping to advance the evidence base. And I think, this is something that our colleagues at the National MCH, like Evidence Center at Georgetown talk about, and really it's, they're doing a lot of actually going through the more like traditional research base and looking at a lot of studies that have been done related to MCH outcomes. And a lot of it's done in, very controlled settings, and there are a lot of gaps, right? There's so much that we don't know about what works. And really Innovation Station and you submitting your practices and what you're actually doing on the ground helps to fill in some of those gaps. And I think that's, while there's maybe no glory in this, that really is such an exciting aspect of Innovation Station, that you're helping us as a field, to grow and to learn from what you're doing. And I do get really excited about that. And then a few other things that we've heard actually from some focus groups that we've done, some additional benefits. One of them is that some folks have mentioned that since they've been added to the Innovation Station database, they've been able to put this on grants, or other sort of funding opportunities that they've applied for, and kind of being in the database helped kind of validate their practice, and they were able to secure additional funding to help sustain or maintain that program long term. And then the last one is related to that. And one of our focus group members mentioned that being an Innovation Station is kind of like the MCH good housekeeping, kind of version of a stamp of approval to a certain respect. So again, it's a way to kind of externally validate or, give credibility to your program, because AMCHIP is, nationally recognized in that way. So just a few more things about the submissions process, and then I'll actually turn it over to Laura to do a deeper dive into the fall review process in particular. So just to let you all know that you can submit a practice at any point in time. However, AMCHIP only reviews practices twice a year right now. That is something that might change in the future as we add more types of resources to the database, but for right now, we review typically in the fall and in the spring. And so fall, usually around October, November, and then April, usually April or May, or sorry, for the spring around April or May. And so for today, we're actually going to release the submissions materials. We made it accessible online right before this webinar started, but then we'll also be pushing it out through different avenues, through different communication channels after our call today. And so with that, I am going to actually turn it over to Laura. And I think a few of you were chatting in the chat box, and I apologize that we did not look at the comments, but I think, Laura, you responded to them. So we should be all set. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Laura. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Linda. So as Linda said, we are now going to be diving a little bit deeper into the fall review that is going to be happening right now. So talking about what's new, the submission process, and then really getting into the nitty-gritty with some application tips and some FAQs that we're often asked. Next slide, please. So starting off with what's new for the fall review. So the biggest thing that we have changed with the submission form for this review is we've really focused the form on health equity. AMCHIP as a whole, as an organization, we're really committed to doing what we can, given our national platform, to try to steer the MCH field towards being more equity focused and anti-racist by nature. And so we've tried to represent that and to embody that in our new submission process, or in our new submission form. So in the past, we used to only ask a health equity question for the cutting edge category. But now you'll notice when you look at the submission form that there are scaled up equity questions throughout all 4 categories that you can apply for. And these questions, some ask about disparities and discrimination in regards to the need that your program addresses. Some questions will look at stakeholder empowerment and how you're engaging stakeholders meaningfully throughout your practice. And also there are some components of equity also embedded into our evaluation questions. And so to recreate this, or to embed equity more deeply into our submission form, we crosswalked all of our different criteria and questions with the frameworks that you can see here on the slide. And we're happy to answer more questions or talk in more depth about this, but you'll notice that the explicit focus on health equity is the biggest thing that's new with our fall review compared to submission forms in the past. Next slide, please. So the document you see here on the screen is our minimum criteria checklist, which Linda mentioned earlier on. This checklist is something that we recommend that all practices look at before submitting, and it will really help you figure out which of the 4 categories that Linda described your practice will fit best into. We are more than happy if you reach out to myself, Laura, or Linda. We're happy to walk through this checklist with you and talk through your practice to see where it may fall. This is also a really helpful resource in terms of getting ready to submit your practice, because it helps you identify kind of from the high level the different types of information or data that you may need to actually complete your submission form. So we definitely recommend that you take a look at our minimum criteria checklist prior to submitting and filling out a submission form. Next slide, please. So here you will see our actual submission form. So our submission form, there is one submission form for all 4 categories, and that's really important to consider. So regardless of what category you are applying for, you will fill out the same submission form. And we recommend and encourage practices to complete all questions that you can. On the form, we're going to ask you to indicate which of our 4 categories you are applying for. So for example, say that you are applying for the emerging category. Our submission form builds, so you will need to complete all of the cutting edge practice questions along with the emerging questions. We also encourage you, even if you are submitting for emerging, if you look at the promising questions and there's a question that you think you may fit, we do encourage you to submit and complete all of the questions that you have information to answer. And when you finish your forms, you can send those, to actually submit your practice, you'll submit the forms to myself, which my email will be, is at the end of this presentation, and it's on all of the forms, as well as you can submit it to our team email, evidence@amchip.org. Next slide, please. So at this point, you may be wondering, how is my practice actually going to be scored? So we engage a team. So each practice is scored by 3 MCH experts. And we ideally try to match our practices to experts who have expertise in the topic area of your specific practice. These reviewers are comprised of different MCH experts from around the state, some in academic institutions, some more in the community-based organization field, some in state health departments, as well as members of AmChip's Best Practice Committee. So those are who are actually reviewing your practices. And we score practices along a 3-point continuum here. And so in order to, a score of a 2 meets expectations, and in order to be awarded a certain practice designation, so for example, to be an emerging practice, you would need to receive points, a score of 2 for all of the questions under cutting edge, as well as all of the questions for emerging. The 3-point option there is really at the reviewer's discretion, and that's if your answer exceeds our expectations. That will help us inform the award process that we can talk a little bit more about later on. Next slide, please. So if your practice is submitted into Innovation Station, you will receive a blank practice summary and implementation guide. And this is what actually is going to be housed in our database. And so this summary form talks about the core components of your practice, so sort of the essence of what your practice is and what you do, different activities of your practice, different outcomes that you've seen, population outcomes or systems outcomes that you see as a result of your practice, collaborations and partnerships that have helped to make your practice successful, the costs associated with your practice, and any lessons learned. These forms here are, the audience for these forms are other practices, other states and territories, jurisdictions who may be interested in implementing your practice. And so once you are submitted into the database, you will be asked to fill out this form. And again, AmChip staff are available to help support you through this and provide technical assistance. Next slide, please. So the timeline for our review. So the submission has been released as of today, and as Linda said, we'll be sending this out after this webinar. Submissions will be due back in 5 weeks, so they will be due on October 30th. So during that time, like we've repeatedly said, please feel free to reach out, and we're really happy to help talk you through your submission and provide any support that you may need. The week of November 2nd, our reviewers are going to receive your submissions, and they'll have 2 weeks to review those submissions. After all 3 of your reviewers have reviewed the submissions, an AmChip staff member will facilitate a review call in which the reviewers will come to consensus on what practice designation your practice receives. And then either you will receive a final designation, the results of the review, the week of the 7th, or, and we like to highlight this, that we do offer a chance for, say reviewers had a question about one of the specific components of your practice, we offer submission clarification opportunities. So AmChip staff will reach out to you to clarify that point. So you do have the opportunity to provide additional feedback to reviewers and help clarify any points to help inform their final decision. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into some of the tips for submitting a practice. So one of our biggest tips is to write the responses to the different questions on the submission form as though the reviewer has never heard of your practice before. We only expect reviewers to review the information that you include in your submission. So it's a benefit to you as a submitter to try to be as thorough as you can in explaining what your practice is, and also make sure that it is something that would be accessible to anyone within the MCH field. Ideally, the reviewer reviewing your practice will be familiar with the topic of your work, but they may not have heard of your practice before. So our next tip is that whenever possible, support your answers with evidence or data. So this can be, for example, when you're describing the need that your practice addresses, providing any state or other data that can help support the need that you're discussing and addressing is really useful for us. As well as when you're getting into for promising and best practices when talking about outcomes, it's really great if you can cite specific data as much as possible. That's really helpful for us from the reviewing side. Another tip is to double check that you have responded to all parts of a question adequately. Some of our questions, there are multiple components or things that we ask you to touch upon. So we just really stress that it's important to read the form really carefully and make sure that you are answering all components of the questions being asked. That will also help expedite the process towards the end of the review. We may need to ask you for fewer submission clarifications, which can delay the overall timeline for when you actually get to hear if you've been accepted into Innovation Station or not. Next slide, please. So our next tip is to provide full responses to each question rather just providing a link to existing reports. This has been an issue in the past if, say, a practice has had an external evaluation done and instead of answering a question regarding outcome data or the impact of the practice, just linking that report. To be fair to our reviewers who are wonderful and they volunteer their time to review these practices, we only expect them to review, as I mentioned, what is in the actual submission form. So there's a section of the form in which you can indicate any publications or external reviews or things that you may have, and you may provide some links there along with a narrative description of those different publications or reports, but we do ask that you write out full narrative responses because that is going to be what your reviewer is actually reviewing. As I mentioned earlier on, we ask that practices try to answer as many questions on the submission form as possible because this can really help us also in providing some tailored feedback and TA to the practices that submit. We really view this process as a TA opportunity and an opportunity for your practice to get feedback from MCH experts. And so it's really important that you try to fill out as many questions as possible so that the feedback you get can be as tailored and relevant as possible. And lastly, if something is unclear or you need any assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out to AMCHIP staff. We are so happy to help support your practice during this application process and to talk through any questions you may have with the process or if you're accepted with the implementation handout. Next slide, please. So now to talk through some frequently asked questions that we often get. So one of those questions that we often hear is how long does it typically take to complete a submission? So a submission typically on average, and this will depend on what category you're applying for, because for example, a best practice, you'll have many more questions to answer than a cutting edge practice, but typically it takes within 3 to 5 hours. I will say though that what can take longer is say you need to reach out to a partner about eval data, to get some information about the budget for the program or things of that nature. That may take a little bit longer. So we do, we do recommend that folks get started on the application as soon as possible, both so that we can provide support if needed and you have time to gather the relevant information. So another question we often are asked are, what are the chances of my practice being accepted? So for each review, we on average will get between 10 to 15 practices in the fall and the spring, so that's roughly 30 per year. And of that, maybe 4 practices won't be accepted in this first round. But like I just mentioned earlier, we really view the submission process as a TA opportunity. And encourage practices, even if you aren't accepted the first time, we're happy to work with you to strengthen your practice and to help you grow and move up our continuum, or if you reapply to get accepted into Innovation Station. So we're really open and willing to provide support and help folks and encourage them to apply again if your practice is not submitted at the first time around. So the next question of how do I know which category my practice best fits into? So that goes back to our handy minimum criteria checklist. That checklist is very detailed and details out the essence of all the different questions that you'll be asked on the submission form, which align with our minimum criteria to be accepted to each category. So that's a really great first resource. And then as I've now mentioned many times, you can also reach out to us for support as well. And so the next question being, what if reviewers need additional information? So that's when we do that submission clarification process. So after the reviewers have had their review call, if there is additional information needed, we as AMCHIP will reach back out to your practice with very specific tailored questions that you will then provide responses to, and we'll send that to our reviewers to make their final designation. So practices have the opportunity to submit additional information, which is something in the past we've gotten positive feedback on, that practices really appreciate that about our application process. So our next FAQ is, what happens after my practice is accepted? So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if the practice is accepted, you will be sent a blank practice summary and implementation handout that we will ask you to fill out. We usually give practices about a month to complete that because we know that life happens, everyone's really busy, especially right now during COVID. So we're very flexible to working with you on that as to what the timing will best suit your needs and is feasible for you. And we are happy to help support you as you complete that implementation handout as well. And then the last question that we get asked about is what our awards process is like. So as Linda mentioned earlier in the call, we have different awards that Innovation Station practices are eligible for. And so of those 3 awards, our best practices committee will actually select awardees for 2 of our awards. And then the Innovation Award is one that practices on the submission form. The very last question on the submission form is an optional question about innovation. And so you have the chance there to explain how you think your practice is innovative and is innovative in its approach to addressing a need. And so we will take that scoring into account when selecting awardees that will be announced at our conference. And so what our award winners actually receive is AmChip will pay for one person from each of those practices to attend the AmChip conference. There's an award ceremony at the conference. You gain that there's a plaque, that national recognition, and it's also a really great networking opportunity and a way to get more publicity for your practice and more support for your practice. So with that, next slide, please. We welcome any and all questions that folks may have about our process, about Innovation Station generally. Anything you may have, feel free to chat them in the chat box here.
So I did want to just address, there was a comment, the last comment that actually came through the chat box asking about which questions you might have to respond to in the submissions form. And so I think it might make more sense once you can actually see the new submissions form. But we mentioned that each of the categories from cutting edge to best practice, they essentially build off of each other, where best practice has to satisfy all of those lower level criteria. But what we've noticed over time is that can make it feel a little redundant sometimes for the promising and best practices, because in emerging, you have to have an evaluation plan. Whereas in a promising, for promising practices and above, they're actually going to have, evaluation data they're reporting. So that's a place where we might indicate, and we've tried to put that in bold throughout. It'll say like, note, if you're applying as a best practice, or if you're applying as a promising or a best practice, skip this question, you can answer it in this section. So we've tried to cut down on that kind of redundancy that might happen because the questions build off of each other. And that might mean we're asking like a higher level of a concept in best practice that we're asking in cutting edge. And it just didn't make sense for you to have to answer it in multiple places. So as much as possible, we've tried to indicate if there were things that you can skip if you're applying as a higher level. But essentially what will happen is that if you're cutting edge, that's the threshold for Innovation Station. So you'll fill out those 5 questions. Same thing for emerging. Emerging essentially is still kind of early on that continuum. So you'll fill out cutting edge plus emerging. And then when you get to the promising and best categories, that's where we've tried to, make it known throughout where you can skip certain questions, where we'll have you respond to a particular question, maybe in a different category. And then I think to Laura's earlier point, just make sure you indicate on the form, there's a place for that at the very beginning, which level you're actually applying for. But we do find it to be helpful, if there are sections that are above what you actually think you are, if you do have some of that information, because what we've noticed during the review calls is that sometimes y'all tend to sell yourselves a little bit short on all of the great work that you're doing. And so we've noticed that people will say they're a cutting edge practice, but they're actually, maybe like emerging or sometimes even promising. And so, if there are other questions you feel like you can respond to, we'll actually review and score you on the section you're applying, or the sections rather, that you're like applying for. But if you do have additional information, we'll certainly take that into account. And thinking about, maybe we reach back out to you and say, like, based on what you've shared, we actually think maybe you should, fill out the rest of the promising section because we think you actually could be there. So we'll make those recommendations. And I think that comes back to Laura's earlier point that, this really is not a punitive process. It's really an opportunity to kind of, learn and grow, the work that you're doing, and to get some, really wonderful feedback from our reviewers. So we do try to make it as, kind of accommodating and flexible in that way. Any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And we also have the Q&A function as well. So whatever you feel comfortable using. While folks are thinking about potential questions to ask, please don't hesitate if there's something that comes to mind, after the orientation today. Like Laura mentioned, we're more than happy to, answer questions. We're happy to get on a call, with you and some of your colleagues if you're not quite sure, if you're ready to submit, or maybe you've looked at the checklist and you can't really decide where your practice falls, or even if you want some, input or suggestions on your submissions form. We've had folks do that in the past where, there are certain responses they've written to certain questions, and they wanted us to check and see, like, is this, enough information for the reviewers, or, things along those lines. So we're always happy to provide that feedback. We just make sure that if we're, providing any input on your submissions form, that we don't get assigned to it as a reviewer, so we can kind of maintain some, objectivity in reviewing it. And I think one other thing to add too, as far as the tips that Laura went through, we actually have a more in-depth tip sheet as well. That is linked in the submissions form. And then we've also added it to the Innovation Station page to the bottom of that, the page that I showed you earlier, where you can access the submissions form and the minimum criteria checklist. So we have a few additional details in there. So some of the ones that people have asked in the past is, is there a word limit? And so this is probably like the one application where we tell you, there is no word limit. More information is better than little information, because again, we want you to write as though, the folks who are reviewing have never heard of your practice, have no idea what it is that you do. And so we want you to, provide those thorough responses. So again, another really helpful resource in helping you to submit your work. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions coming through. So I hope that means that, oh, okay, good question. So for the submissions, that's a great question. So actually I will ask Laura what your preference is. We've had it both ways, but I'll see, Laura, just from your perspective, since you will be handling these, what your preference is.
So if you could submit it as a Word form, that would be beneficial for us. We will de-identify any personal information of yours before sharing the forms with the reviewers. So for example, on the form, we ask for your name and some more personal information of the person submitting. And so if you could submit it as a Word document, that would be really useful for us. And then we will send it as a PDF to your reviewers. But great question. Thank you for clarifying that. And I can be sure to, when emailing everyone later with the actual documents, I will be sure to let you know that and add that tip in there.
I'm thinking about it. It might actually be in the submissions form. I feel like we've been feverishly updating so many documents. I can't remember where we indicated certain things at this point, but definitely a good question. Okay, any other questions or anything else that comes to mind? Okay, so I'll just advance us to our last slide here. So not seeing any more questions, just wanting to share our contact information. And I'm also, I haven't checked to look yet, but we also have another brand new member of our team. So we have a brand new intern who's actually going to be supporting the review process. So you might also see some emails and information coming from her. So that's Salome Araya, and she is fabulous. Today is her very first day at AMSHIP. So be on the lookout for any sort of emails or updates from her as well. And with that, we will close out. So again, just from both of us, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Innovation Station. I hope all of you are really excited and definitely leaning towards submitting something for the fall review. If not, we hope we catch you for the spring review. But please, stay in touch. We'd love to work with you, to support you, and to help you get your work into an Innovation Station. So with that, again, we'll close out, and we'll be sure to share, again, the links, to all of the resources and tools that we shared. And we can also send you the recording to this as well, if it'd be helpful for you to refer to it, or if you want to pass it along to any of your colleagues. So with that, thank you so much, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you, everyone.